Well, hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I am still your host, Dr. B. We are in the 14th week of a 16-week term. Yeah! All right, we're almost done. Uh, 14-week, 16-week term here at UDC. Uh, Today we're going to talk about aggregate supply and demand. That covers chapters 20 and 21. And the word aggregate, I want to describe to you in very simple terms. Because the word aggregate, that's kind of like a $5 word. But the word aggregate is real simple. It means the whole, WHOLE, the whole pie, the whole pie, the whole thing, the whole kick and caboodle, the whole enchilada, the whole thing. That's what the word aggregate means. It means the whole. So when we talk about supply and demand, we talk about the entire supply, the entire demand. So that's what the word aggregate means. So just keep it simple. The word aggregate means the entire thing. So as you know, in economics, things go up and down. Okay, it's never consistent. It never stays the same. We have good years, we have bad years. You know, 1929, bad year. Yeah, that was a Great Depression. Yep. 2008, bad year. That was the Great Recession. Uh, Currently, we are heading toward recession. Economic activity fluctuates from year to year. We have good years and we have bad years. Yeah? Good years, economic growth. Bad years, recession. Okay? Sometimes depression, 1929, for example. Recessions are points of economic contraction where we have two consecutive periods of reduction in gross domestic product. When we have two consecutive periods, 2 3-month periods, yeah, what do they call those? 2 quarters of retraction of gross domestic product shrinking, we call that a recession. Technically, the United States entered a technical recession last quarter because we had 2 consecutive quarters of economic decline in gross domestic product. So we had a technical recession. It didn't feel like a recession because in most recessions, we typically see losses in real income and we see an increase in unemployment. We did not see that in 2022. We saw 2 consecutive quarters of reduction in gross domestic product, which means a recession. But we did not see a reduction in income or an increase in unemployment. So it's an unusual recession that we saw. And from my understanding, it looks like we might be out of that recession. However, if you look at the current news, you see a lot of layoffs in tech industry, right? Oh, Google's laying people off, Facebook's laying people off. Well, we're not even going to talk about Twitter, but Twitter's laying people off. We see a lot of layoffs in high tech spaces. Amazon laying people off, and we see that in other industries too. A little bit in manufacturing, people getting laid off, and a little bit in other sectors. But we also see growth in terms of in the service sector. So interesting, very interesting situation that we're in. So will we see a recession in 2023? My guess is yes. I think we will see a recession in 2023. Um, and it might be a typical recession where we see reduction in gross domestic product, we see a reduction in income, and we see rising unemployment. It's certainly possible, and I think it's very likely in 2023 to see that. Why does economic fluctuation happen? Well, the business cycle. It's unpredictable. It's irregular. So it causes recessions and times of growth. Yeah, absolutely. It goes up and down. Business is cyclical, right? Uh, think of like a seasonal business. We know that it has a cycle. It's great for 3 seasons out of the year. Uh, so that's one way of thinking about why we see economic fluctuation. We also see that quantity fluctuates during times of recession. I want you to think about this one. During the times of the pandemic, we've seen times of shortages for products, right? On the grocery shelves, there's shortages of certain products, and we see that currently as well. This is a sign of recession. Okay, uh, the reason why we see these shortages is because the supply oftentimes cannot meet the demand, and that is oftentimes a symptom of recession because the products that are trying to be supplied cannot be manufactured due to a business cycle recession. For example, we look at, we'll say, Post cereal or Kellogg's. Okay, the Kellogg company, they make a lot of different products, not just cereal. They make a lot of breakfast products. They make a lot of other food products. You know, they're a huge conglomerate, and they have been experiencing shortages of certain products throughout the pandemic, but it's not a cause. It's not an effect from the pandemic. It's not an effect. It's actually a sign of recession when you see product shortages in the grocery store. Um, so we'll talk a little bit more about those product quantity fluctuations in a little bit. But think when you see those types of shortages in the grocery store, think that that is a sign of a recession, and it's not just a byproduct of the pandemic. We see output decreasing and unemployment rising, typically during times of recession. Although I will say that the recession of 2022, soon to be 2023, I think will be a little bit different. We won't see as much unemployment. Typically, recessions are very short lived. A couple of quarters, maybe a full year. Typically, they don't last very long. It's common to see 1 or 2 quarters, 2 quarters or more. That's what we call a recession of decreases in gross domestic product. It's unusual to see it a long one. A long one is a sign of a depression, which we saw in 1929. 1929 to about 1932-ish, there were many quarters of loss in gross domestic product, which ultimately was a result from the collapse of the financial system. And we can see that repeating in 2008 to about 2009, almost 2010, we were at a time of a very serious recession. And we see that here in the graph. And that recession lasted longer than most do. So that's why we see that part of the chart's a little bit wider. What will it look like in 2020? You know, with 2020 there was a sharp downward spike, but then a quick upward spike. It was more, we call it a V-shaped recovery. But what will it look like in 2023? I don't know. It depends on how long the recession lasts. I don't think it'll last very long. I think it'll be very short-lived, like they normally are. You can also see what happens with investment spending. At times of recession, it's typically what it's a result of what we see in the central bank. You know that when we have inflation, the central bank increases the interest rates. When they increase the interest rates, it makes it difficult to get loans, right? It makes it more expensive to borrow. So because of that, we see a lot less investment in businesses when there are higher interest rates. And the higher interest rates sometimes also cause recessions. And we see that as a direct impact of that in 2008 to 2010. The unemployment rate typically mirrors recessions. We see that the unemployment rate spikes at times of recession. 2008 to 2010, the unemployment rate was very high. It was about 10%, very, very high, especially here in the United States. Our average unemployment rate when it's good is around 3%. And that's actually a good place to be for unemployment rate is about 3%. What will it look like in 2023? I think it'll probably be closer to 4 or 5%. It's my thought, just based off what's happened. So it's important to understand that there are a couple of variables at play when we talk about these economic fluctuations. When the economy is good, gross domestic product is up, productivity is up, and wages are up. When the economy is bad, wages decrease, we have an increase in unemployment, and it's usually more difficult to get a loan. Those are the variables that we deal with in an economy. Yeah? So that's a classical dichotomy. The monetary side of things, there's not really too much of a change in the money supply. However, the interest rate is what has an effect on the ability to borrow. Especially during downturns in the economy, we see that the interest rates are typically high. And because of that, that's why businesses don't take out more loans and invest in their companies to grow them, because it's expensive to borrow when there's a downturn in the economy. In the long run side of things, in order to help the economy out, sometimes the government might change the money supply. If we experience a long recession, we'll say from 2023 to 2025, if that were to happen, we'll see prices come down. We'll see the interest rate eventually come down. That will help to bring up GDP. Unemployment will go down a little bit. The changes in the money supply typically don't affect GDP or unemployment. Changes in the money supply affect the prices of goods that we pay for based off of interest rates. In the long term, interest rates have a serious impact on prices and quantity supply. In the short run, with these economic fluctuations, we assume that there's not going to be huge changes when it comes to money supply. We also assume that there are real and nominal variables that are intertwined, such as the unemployment rate, the cost of goods, the real wages, interest rates, etc. Those are variables that are intertwined. When there's changes in the money supply, it has a small effect on GDP in the short run. But in the long run, the changes are very nominal. Earlier I had mentioned the word aggregate. It means the whole. It's the whole pie. Okay, the word aggregate means the entire amount. So when we talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, I'm talking about all demand, all supply. Okay, the word aggregate means the entire thing. It's the sum of all of the components. That's what the word aggregate means. So when you hear the word aggregate, think the entire thing. So I'll show you a model that shows all demand and all supply. Economists use this model of all demand and all supply to explain fluctuations in the economy, both short run and long run. The aggregate demand curve, the entire demand curve, shows the quantity of goods and services, all of them. All of them. They're used by households, firms, the government, and customers abroad. Everyone. Another way of saying that want to buy at each price level the products. And the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping and to the right, like most demand curves are. The aggregate supply curve shows all of the quantity of goods and services, all of them, that companies choose to produce and sell at each price level, and it's upward sloping and to the right, just like most supply curves are. Supply and demand is something that we've been talking about in this course since the very beginning. Yeah, about week 1, week 2. Yeah, we've been talking about supply and demand. We still are, because that's what economics is. It's the concept of supply and demand with a point of equilibrium. Supply meets demand. When we talk about aggregate, we're talking about all supply, all demand. The word aggregate, it means the sum of all components. That's the definition of aggregate. Economists use this concept to explain fluctuations in the economy. We talk about all of the supply, all of the demand. We talk about where those two meet, the point of equilibrium. The point of equilibrium represents the price level where supply and demand meet and the output of the economy. So as supply and demand change, so will the output. So that's why we use this type of concept to explain these shifts in the economy, fluctuations. So as you know, as we've talked about in the past, when we talk about gross domestic product, we look at consumer spending, investing, government spending, and net exports. Consumer spending plus investments plus government spending plus net exports is gross domestic product, or Y. We can use this formula to also explain the aggregate demand curve, where C, instead of consumer spending, is what we call the wealth effect. It's the same thing, right? The more money you have, the more money you spend. Consumer spending, that's wealth, right? That's what wealth is. So wealth effect, C. Investment, yeah, for GDP. For the demand curve, we'll talk about interest rate effect. G is still government spending, and net exports we'll consider to be the exchange rate. That makes sense, right? Because when you're selling products abroad, exporting them, we examine the exchange rate. So really, what we're just substituting those three things: wealth effect for consumer spending. It's the same thing. Wealth is represented by consumer spending. The interest rate is represented by investments. And the exchange rate is represented by net exports. G is still government spending. That's, of course, dictated by policy. So wealth effect plus interest rate plus exchange rate plus, wealth effect plus interest rate plus government spending plus exchange rate is the demand curve in a formula. Wealth effect, as I mentioned earlier, it's the same as consumer spending. Consumers are wealthy based off of their income and their spending. The more that they spend and the more that they make increases the quantity demand for goods and services. The more money you have, the more you want and the more you spend. Very simple. When we talk about the interest rate, we're talking about investment, right? There's a decrease in the interest rate, there's an increase in spending. That makes sense. Investment products, property, plant, and equipment. There's an increase in the quantity demand for goods and services. Investment. Yeah. Lower interest rate, more investing. Higher interest rate, less investing. Very simple. Net exports, also represented as the exchange rate. Decrease in U.S. prices, there's a decrease in the interest rate. The U.S. dollar depreciates in value. So lower interest rates, lower value in the U.S. dollar. This increases net exports. When the dollar is weak, we export more because there's a higher demand abroad when the dollar is weak, as that purchasing power goes farther. There's an increase in the quantity demand for goods and services. Makes sense. Lower interest rate, higher demand. When prices of things go down, the demand goes up. Right? Of course. Price goes down, you want more goods and services. Very simple. Why does that happen? Because individual consumers are wealthier, there's a lower interest rate, and the value of the dollar is lower. Yeah, very straightforward. When there's an increase in prices, of course the opposite is true. Consumers don't have as much spending power. There's higher interest rates, and the value of the dollar goes up. So it's the exact opposite. So let's look at the aggregate demand based off of price changes. When the price is high, there's a decrease in the supply demanded, right? There's a decrease in demand when the price is high. When the price goes down to P2, the demand goes up. There's more of the product demanded. Makes perfect sense. There might be a shift in the demand curve, aggregate demand curve, when there's a change in consumer spending, investing, government purchases, and net exports. Anytime there's a change in one of these elements in the formula for the demand curve, there's going to be a shift in the demand curve. When there's a change in consumption, that typically means that there was a change in taxes. Okay, what do I mean by that? When the government decides to change the tax brackets, let's say they reduce the taxes for individuals, that gives you more purchasing power. Why? Because you have more in your pocket. Less going to the government, more going to you. Yeah, that's a good thing. That increases your personal wealth. The more money that you maintain after taxes, the wealthier you are. Wealth is determined by your purchasing power. Okay? Not by the actual dollars in your pocket, but your ability to use those dollars. That's what wealth is measured by. People think, oh, they got a lot of money, they must be wealthy. No, it's their ability to use the money. That's what makes them wealthy. You can be very wealthy. How can you be wealthy? You have money, you can spend that money. That makes you wealthy. That's the concept behind wealth. It's not about how much money somebody has. It's about how they use it. There's changes in taxes. If the taxes go down, people become wealthier. If the taxes go up, people are less wealthy. There's an increase in consumer spending. The demand curve shifts to the right. For investing, when companies gain wealth, they want to invest more. They invest more because there's a decrease in the interest rates. Right? Decrease in interest rates, companies tend to spend more on property, plant, and equipment, investing in the company. They do invest in things like better technology, as a result of a tax policy change or a money supply change. There's an increase in the investment. There's a shift in the demand curve to the right. Of course, the opposite's true, right? If there's higher interest rates, there's going to be less investing. The demand curve shifts to the left. Changes in government purchases. The government might build new roads, build new schools, do things with infrastructure, etc. These changes are a result of changes in government policy. There's an increase in government purchases, spending, the demand curve shifts to the right. The opposite is also true. If there's less government spending, it shifts to the left. Net exports. When there's changes in net exports, it's a result of a couple of factors. There could be a recession somewhere else in the world, like in Europe. International speculation on exchange rates. These result in an increase in net exports because the value of the dollar goes down. That means that there will be an increase in net exports. This will cause a shift in the demand curve to the right. And yes, the opposite is also true. Shift to the left when the value of the dollar goes up, or countries are doing well and there's no recession, etc. So in the long run, price levels typically don't affect gross domestic product. Things that do are supply of labor, capital, natural resources, available of technology. Those kind of things affect in the long run. In the short run, the aggregate supply curve is going to be upward sloping to the right. Take a look at this example. You see the supply curve straight up and down. This represents the level of output. The level of output, as you know, is determined by its inputs of technology, labor, capital, etc. The level of output is up and down because it is not affected by changes in price. Natural level of output is based off of the production of goods and services, as you know. The economy achieves in the long term when unemployment is at its normal rate. Here in the United States, the normal rate is about 3%. In 1929, at the time of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was close to 25 to 30%. From 2008 to 2010, at the time of the Great Recession, the unemployment rate was about 10 to 12%. Currently, the unemployment rate stands at about 3.5%, and it's increasing slightly because the United States is heading toward a recession. As I mentioned earlier, recessions do not typically last long. They usually last maybe a year or so, sometimes much less. Recessions are dictated by 2 consecutive quarters of loss in gross domestic product. Technically, we had a recession in 2022. Quarters 2 and 3 both lost gross domestic product. So technically, we had a recession. However, we did not see the same rate of unemployment. What will it look like in 2023? I think we might have a recession. I think the unemployment rate will go up a little bit. But I don't think it'll last long. I think it might last maybe half a year at most. Unemployment rates typically around 3%. That's the normal rate. When we have full employment, the output is typically very high. Yeah, that means everyone's very efficient at their jobs, and we are producing a lot of goods and services. That's what we shoot for. That's the goal. There might be a shift in the supply curve based off of other changes in things like labor, based off unemployment, capital, the availability of resources, capital, money. The change might be based off of changes in the interest rate. Changes in natural resources, run out of water, that'd be bad. Low on coal, low on whatever, lithium, I don't know. Change in natural resources, that usually raises prices when we're low on things. Or when there's changes in technological knowledge, as we produce more robots to help us in the production process, things become cheaper, which also have an impact on the supply. Labor changes based off of the unemployment rate. Unemployment goes up during a time of recession, goes down when things are good. Those changes impact the supply curve. When things are good, supply curve shifts to the right. When things are bad, it shifts to the left. Very straightforward. When there's changes in capital based off of the changes in interest rates, or it could be physical and human capital, not enough buildings, too many buildings, etc. Things are good, shifts to the right. Things are bad, shifts to the left. Changes in natural resources such as water, electricity, other things based off of weather. Yeah. Things are good, it shifts to the right. Things are bad, it shifts to the left. Technology. As we get more robots in place, other technological advances to the supply chain, decrease in government regulation around self-driving cars, etc. Those technological advances that are good, it shifts the supply curve to the right. I haven't really seen it shift to the left with technology, but you never know. If for whatever reason the technology fails, it'll shift to the left. In the long run, the demand and supply curves will shift based off of things like technological process, monetary supply, change in the monetary supply based off of interest rates in order to combat inflation. And as a result, you might see continued growth in output and continued inflation. Interesting stuff. But it behaves exactly as you would expect it to, right? We've talked so much about supply and demand. We know that when things are bad, it shifts to the left. When it's good, it shifts to the right. We also know that supply and demand is based off of availability of goods and services, the demand for those goods and services at particular prices at particular times. Uh, and so we see the aggregate shifts in supply and demand based off of those things. And that's what we've been talking about for the past 13 weeks in this course. So it's really putting everything together, right? Hopefully this is very obvious to all of you because we've been talking about this kind of thing for a while. The aggregate supply curves slope upward to the right in the short run. Long run is kind of like a vertical. Price levels affect the economy's output. If price goes up, output goes down. Price goes down, output goes up. Increasing the overall supply levels in the economy based off of the changes in quantity of goods and services. And the decrease in the level of prices will typically result in a decrease in the quantity of goods and services supplied. Again, we've talked so much about this concept as well, when it comes to the supply curve. Short-run changes in the supply curve are based off of wages, prices, and misperceptions. Wages typically slow to adjust in changing economic conditions. For example, we're currently faced with higher inflation rates, but wages are slow to adjust to those inflation rates. Inflation's rising at a much faster pace than our wages are. It's unfortunately a normal thing. We call that sticky wages. Wages also change based off of expected price changes. Again, part of inflation. But there's no immediate response to the actual price level. It's usually different than what was expected. So if inflation increases by 8%, your wages might increase by 3%. They're slow to change, right? That's the wage theory. When price levels are lower than the expected price rate, there's low incentives to produce. When the price levels are greater than the expected rate, there's more incentive to produce more goods and services. Prices of goods and services are slow to adjust based off of economic conditions. We call this menu price adjustments. When we talk about pricing, when things in the market change, the prices will change based off of those economic conditions. With inflation, for example, go to the out to eat, and you're like, oh, I was just here last week, and that burger was $10, now it's 11, then it's 12. But it took a while for it to get there. It wasn't an immediate thing. Like as soon as we realized we had an inflation problem, the prices of everything didn't just jack up immediately. They gradually rose. They're slow to adjust. Changes in the price levels can sometimes be misinterpreted or be false. What I mean by that is sometimes we perceive a change in the market. That perception is incorrect. It didn't actually happen. Or we thought it's going to happen, but then didn't happen. So, example, with inflation, right? Let's say you're a producer and you produce shoes, okay? Let's say you're Nike. You're Nike, okay? You produce shoes. You saw inflation coming. So you decided, you know what, I'm going to produce less shoes because I need to keep my costs low during times of inflation. And I also know that the consumers, they'll pay a little bit more, but they're not going to pay a whole lot more. So I keep my costs low by producing less shoes. It's the perception. But then inflation wasn't as bad as you thought. So now you're still selling shoes, but you produced less. That's a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. So it's a misperception. That kind of thing happens because things are hard to predict. Quantity of the supply is based off of the natural level of output plus the actual price level minus the expected price. And that gives us the expected quantity of output. Very simple formula. In the short run, changes in labor, capital, natural resources, and other technological advantages will impact the supply. Expected price levels will go up, which will cause a shift to the left. Why does economic fluctuations happen? Well, if you look at the long run, changes happen because of changes in price and the natural level of output. We also expect that the aggregate demand will equal the aggregate supply when the price that we expect to pay is the actual price, i.e., there's no inflation, there's no change. Does it happen? Sometimes. But in looking at supply and demand in the point of equilibrium based off of the long run supply and short run supply, we can see that the equilibrium price is the natural level of output where supply and demand meet, where long run supply and short run supply are equivalent to the aggregate demand. So when we look at supply, there's a long run and a short run. In the long run, changes are based off of changes in labor, capital, environment, etc. In the short run, changes are based off changes in price. That's a way of thinking about it. The demand in the short run, outputs goes down, price levels go down. Long run, supply shift goes up, outputs at the natural level and price level falls. Here's what that graph looks like. But again, these changes are based off of what we had talked about, why supply and demand have fluctuations. We can see GDP. Average growth around 10%. It's probably a little less than that now. During the time of the Great Depression, we see that gross domestic product actually shrank by near 20%, which is extremely bad. During World War II, when the United States was manufacturing at very high rates to supply for the war efforts, GDP was at 40%, very, very high. After the war had ended, GDP shrank significantly because everyone came home and turned into consumers. And then it went up and down, up and down, up and down for every year from then on into the current day, where gross domestic product is currently hovering probably, well, beginning of 2020 was negative 10%. Currently, we're hovering probably around zero because of 2022's economic downturn. 2023, I think will probably shrink a little bit. It'll probably be close to minus 5%. Changes in the supply based off of uh, increase in production costs, stagflation, and in the long run, things will return to their natural levels and prices will come back down. I think that's what will happen eventually when inflation gets under control. Can I just talk about that? Great. Uh, Now that we got that part covered, let's talk about the next association with aggregate supply and demand. So please stand by. We're going to shift to chapter 21.